Chapter 11, Part 2 of Aircraft and Submarines by Willis J. Abbot. This Librivox Recording is in the public domain. Recording by William Tomcho. Beginning of Submarine Invention, Part 2. Many and various have been the opinions on this strange, useless, and fatal experiment, though the more reasonable part of mankind seem to give it up as wholly impracticable. It is well known that pent-up air, when overcharged with the vapors emitted out of animal bodies, becomes unfit for respiration, for which reason those confined in the diving bell, after continuing some time under water, are obliged to come up and take in fresh air, or by some such means recruit it. That any man should be able after having sunk a vessel to so great a depth to make that vessel at pressure so much more specifically lighter than water as thereby to enable it to force its way to the surface through the depressure of so great a weight is a matter not hastily to be credited. Even cork, when sunk to a certain depth, will, by the great weight of the fluid upon it, be prevented from rising. The English of the Annual Register leaves much to be desired in clarity. It makes reasonably clear, however, that the unfortunate Mr. Day's knowledge of submarine conditions was, by no means, equal to Mr. Blake's sporting spirit. Even to day 100 feet is an unusual depth of submersion for the largest submarines. The credit for using a submarine boat for the first time in actual warfare belongs to a Yankee, David Bushnell. He was born in Saybrook, Connecticut, and graduated from Yale with the class of 1775. While still in college he was interested in science, and as far as his means and opportunities allowed, he devoted a great deal of his time and energy to experimental work. The problem which attracted his special attention was how to explode powder under water, and before very long he succeeded in solving this to his own satisfaction as well as to that of a number of prominent people, amongst whom were the Governor of Connecticut and his council. Bushnell's experiments, of course, fell in the period during which the Revolutionary War was fought, and when he had completed his invention there naturally presented itself to him a further problem. How could his device be used for the benefit of his country and against the British ships which were then threatening New York City? As a means to this end, Bushnell planned and built a submarine boat which on account of its shape is usually called the Turtle. General Washington thought very highly of Bushnell, whom he called in a letter to Thomas Jefferson a man of great mechanical powers, fertile in inventions, and master of execution. In regard to Bushnell's submarine boat, the same letter, written after its failure, says, "I thought and still think that it was an effort of genius, but that too many things were necessary to be combined to expect much against an enemy who are always on guard." During the whole period of the building of the Turtle, Bushnell was in ill health. Otherwise he would have navigated it on its trial trip himself, for he was a man of undoubted courage and wrapped up alike in the merits of his invention and in the possibility of utilizing it to free New York from the constant ignominy of the presence of British ships in its harbor. But his health made this out of the question. Accordingly he taught his brother the method of navigating the craft, but at the moment for action the brother too fell ill. It became necessary to hire an operator. This was by no means easy, as volunteers to go below the water in a submarine boat of a type hitherto undreamed of, and to attach an explosive to the hull of a British man of war, the sentries upon which were presumably especially vigilant, being in a hostile harbor, was an adventure likely to attract only the most daring and reckless spirits. In a letter to Thomas Jefferson, other portions of which we shall have occasion to quote later, Bushnell refers to this difficulty in finding a suitable operator, and tells briefly and with evident chagrin the story of the failure of the attempts made to utilize successfully his submarine. After various attempts to find an operator to my wish, I sent one who appeared more expert than the rest from New York to a 50-gun ship lying not far from Governor's Island. He went under the ship and attempted to fix the wooden screw into her bottom, but struck, as he supposes, a bar of iron which passes from the rudder hinge and is spiked under the ship's quarter. Had he moved a few inches, which he might have done without rowing, I have no doubt that he would have found wood where he might have fixed the screw, or if the ship were sheathed with copper he might easily have pierced it. but not being well skilled in the management of the vessel, in attempting to move to another place, he lost the ship. After seeking her in vain for some time, he rowed some distance and rose to the surface of the water, but found daylight had advanced so far that he durst not renew the attempt. He says that he could easily have fastened the magazine under the stern of the ship above water, as he rowed up to the stern and touched it before he descended. Had he fastened it there, the explosion of 150 pounds of powder, the quantity contained in the magazine, must have been fatal to the ship. In his return from the ship to New York, he passed near Governor's Island, and thought he was discovered by the enemy on the island. Being in haste to avoid the danger he feared, he cast off the magazine, as he imagined it retarded him in the swell, which was very considerable. After the magazine had been cast off 1 hour, the time the internal apparatus was set to run, it blew up with great violence. Afterward there were 2 attempts made in Hudson's River, above the city, but they effected nothing. One of them was by the aforementioned person. In going towards the ship he lost sight of her, and went a great distance beyond her. When he at length found her, the tide ran so strong that, as he descended under water for the ship's bottom, it swept him away. Soon after this the enemy went up the river and pursued the boat which had the submarine vessel on board, and sunk it with their shot. Though I afterwards recovered the vessel, I found it impossible at that time to prosecute the design any further. The operator to whom Bushnell had entrusted his submarine boat was a typical Yankee, Ezra Lee of Lyme, Connecticut. His story of the adventure differs but little from that of Bushnell, but it is told with a calm indifference to danger and a seeming lack of any notion of the extraordinary in what he had done that gives an idea of the man. When I rowed under the stern of the ship, the Eagle, I could see the men on deck and hear them talk, he wrote. I then shut down all the doors, sunk down, and came up under the bottom of the ship. This means that he hermetically sealed himself inside of a craft shaped like 2 upper turtle shells joined together, hence the name of the turtle. He had entered through the orifice at the top, whence the head of the turtle usually protrudes. This before sinking he had covered and made watertight by screwing down upon it a brass crown or top like that to a flask. Within he had enough air to support him 30 minutes. The vessel stood upright, not flat as a turtle carries himself. It was maintained in this position by lead ballast. Within, the operator occupied an upright position, half sitting, half standing. To sink water was admitted, which gathered in the lower part of the boat, while to rise again this was expelled by a force pump. There were ventilators and portholes for the admission of light and air when operating on the surface, but once the cap was screwed down the operator was in darkness. In this craft, which suggests more than anything else a curiously shaped submarine coffin, Lee drifted along by the side of the ship, navigating with difficulty with a single oar and seeking vainly to find some spot to which he might affix his magazine. A fact which might have disquieted a more nervous man was that the clockwork of this machine was running and had been set to go off in an hour from the time the voyage was undertaken. As to almost anyone in that position minutes would seem hours. The calmness of Sailor Lee's nerves seems to be something beyond the ordinary. When he finally abandoned the attempt on the Eagle, he started up the bay. Off Governor's Island he narrowly escaped capture. When I was abreast of the fort on the island, 300 or 400 men got upon the parapet to observe me. At length a number came down to the shore, shoved off a 12-oared barge with 5 or 6 sitters, and pulled for me. I eyed them, and when they had got within 50 or 60 yards of me, I let loose the magazine in hopes that if they should take me they would likewise pick up the magazine, and then we should all be blown up together. But as kind Providence would have it, they took fright and returned to the island, to my infinite joy. The magazine, after getting a little past the island, went off with a tremendous explosion, throwing up large bodies of water to an immense height. During the last quarter of the 18th and during the first half of the 19th century, France was the chief center for the activities of submarine inventors. However, very few of the many plans put forward in this period were executed. The few exceptions resulted in little else than trial boats, which usually did not live up to the expectations of their inventors or their financial backers and were, therefore, discarded in quick order. In spite of this lack of actual results, this particular period was of considerable importance to the later development of the submarine. Almost every one of the many boats then projected or built contained some innovation, and in this way some of the many obstacles were gradually overcome. Strictly speaking, the net result of the experimental work done during these 75 years by a score or more of men, most of whom were French, though a few were English, was the creation of a more sane and sound basis on which, before long, other men began to build with greater success. The one notable accomplishment of interest, especially to Americans, was a submarine built in 1800 by Robert Fulton. Fulton, of course, is far better known by his work in connection with the discovery and development of steam navigation. Born in Pennsylvania in 1765, he early showed marked mechanical genius. In 1787 he went to England with the purpose of studying art under the famous painter West, but soon began to devote most of his time and energy to mechanical problems. Not finding in England as much encouragement as he had hoped, he went, in 1797, to Paris, and for the next 7 years lived there in the house of the American minister, Joel Barlow. As soon as he had settled down in France, he offered his plans of a submarine boat, which he called the Nautilus, to the French government. Though a special commission reported favorably on this boat, the opposition of the French Minister of the Marine was too strong to be overcome, even after another commission had approved a model built by Fulton. In 1800, however, he was successful in gaining the moral and financial support of Napoleon Bonaparte, then First Consul of the French Republic. Fulton immediately proceeded to build the Nautilus, and completed the boat in May, 1801. It was cigar shaped, about 7 feet in diameter and over 21 feet in length. The hull was of copper strengthened by iron ribs. The most noticeable features were a collapsible mast and sail and a small conning tower at the forward end. The boat was propelled by a wheel affixed to the center of the stern and worked by a hand winch. A rudder was used for steering, and increased stability was gained by a keel which ran the whole length of the hull. Soon after completion the boat was taken out for a number of trial trips, all of which were carried out with signal success, and finally culminated on June 26, 1801, in the successful blowing up of an old ship furnished by the French government. Although the Nautilus created a great sensation, popular as well as official interest began soon to flag. Fulton received no further encouragement, and finally gave up his submarine experiments. In 1806 he returned to America. By 1814 he had built another submarine boat which he called the Mute. It was, comparatively speaking, of immense size, being over 80 feet long, 21 feet wide, and 14 feet deep, and accommodating 100 men. It was iron plated on top, and derived its peculiar name from the fact that it was propelled by a noiseless engine. Before its trials could be completed, Fulton died on February 24, 1815, and no one seemed to have sufficient interest or faith in his new boat to continue his work. In the middle of the 19th century, for the first time, a German became seriously interested in submarines. His name was Wilhelm Bauer. He was born in 1822 in a small town in Bavaria, and though a turner by trade, joined the army in 1842. Bauer was even in his youth of a highly inventive turn of mind. He possessed an indomitable will and an unlimited supply of enthusiasm. Step by step he acquired, in what little time he could spare from his military duties, the necessary mechanical knowledge, and finally, supported financially by a few loyal friends and patrons, he built his first submarine at Kiel at a cost of about $2,750. It sank to the bottom on its first trial trip, fortunately without anyone on board. Undaunted, he continued his efforts. When he found that his support at Kiel was weakening, he promptly went to Austria. In spite of glowing promises, opposition on the part of some officials deprived Bauer of the promised assistance. He went then to England, and succeeded in enlisting the interest of the Prince Consort. A boat was built according to Bauer's plans, which, however, he was forced by the interference of politicians to change to such an extent that it sank on its first trial with considerable loss of life. Still, full of faith in his ability to produce a successful submarine, Bauer now went to Russia. In 1855 he built a boat at St. Petersburg and had it accepted by the Russian government. It was called Le Diable Marin, and looked very much like a dolphin. Its length was 52 feet, its beam 12 feet 5 inches, and its depth 11 feet. Its hull was of iron. A propeller, worked by 4 wheels, furnished motive power. Submersion and stability were regulated by 4 cylinders into which water could be pumped at will. The first trial of the boat was made on May 26, 1856, and was entirely successful. In later trials as many as 14 men at a time descended in Le Diable Marin. It is said that Bauer made a total of 134 trips on his boat. All but 2 were carried out successfully. At one time, however, the propeller was caught in some seaweed, and it was only by the quickest action that all the water was pumped out and the bow of the boat allowed to rise out of the water, so that the occupants managed to escape by means of the hatchway. Like Fulton in France, Bauer now experienced in Russia a sudden decrease of official interest. When he finally lost his boat, about 4 weeks later, he also lost his courage, and in 1858 he returned to Germany, where he later died in comparative poverty. Contemporary with Bauer submarines and immediately following them were a large number of other boats. Some of these were little more than freaks. Others failed in certain respects, but added new features to the sum total of submarine inventions. As early as 1854, Monsieur Marie Davy, professor of chemistry at Montpellier University, suggested an electromagnetic engine as motive power. In 1855 a well known engineer, J. Nasmyth, suggested a submerged motor driven by a steam engine. None of the boats of this period proved successful enough, however, to receive more than passing notice, and very few indeed ever reached the trial stage. But before long the rapid development of internal combustion engines and the immense progress made by the study of electricity was to advance the development of submarines by leaps and bounds. End of Beginnings of Submarine Invention, Part II.